Our second class this afternoon from the BYU Family History Library is by James Tanner, and he'll be teaching us about beginning your genealogy in Portugal. We appreciate very much James' great knowledge of genealogy and family history, and will be very interested in hearing what he has to say about this topic. So I'll now turn the time over to him.
Okay. Well, glad to be here for another class. One of the reasons that we chose to, from time to time, choose to do a focused class on a particular country and the particular country's records is because we look out there on the greater genealogical community and determine that there are some weaknesses or holes in the instructions about certain countries. So that was the case with Portugal, and we decided to have a particular presentation on Portuguese records. So we'll get right into it. The prehistory, or the history of Portugal, dates back to way back into prehistoric times. Some of the artifacts are thousands and thousands of years old. It's a very ancient country, has a lot of history, and we're going to see how that all sorts out here with genealogical records. Portugal is on the what's called the Iberian Peninsula, and it has a very complex history of invasions and conflicts. And all of those have very effectively changed the way that the people speak and the way the languages that are in that the Iberian Peninsula have evolved, and also affect the historical records that have been kept. Portugal's been invaded by the Romans and was in part of the Roman Empire for a very long time, the Visigoths, Muslims, England, and France. So we're had a number of major effects on both the language and the history of the country. Spain has access to both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea. Portugal only has access to the Atlantic, so it's there's some history that creates, and the issues that have occurred between Portugal and the surrounding countries. There are 5 languages spoken on the Iberian Peninsula. Sometimes we look at the map and we say, "Oh, that's Spain, and they speak Spanish." And the answer is, well, that's Spain, but they don't all speak Spanish. The languages are Portuguese, which is spoken, of course, in that area of Portugal. And arguably, you could say that Portuguese and the other languages, Castilian, Catalan, Galician, Basque, and Aranese, are all kind of derivative Spanish Romance languages. However, they're not mutually easily understood. In other words, carrying on a conversation between someone who speaks Spanish and someone who speaks Portuguese is very difficult. From time to time, I get consultations where, even though the Family History Library or Family Search Library now up in Salt Lake City specifies that the consultation should be in Spanish, I do get Portuguese speakers who sometimes think they can converse in Spanish, which, by the way, does not happen well. So some of these languages are even less understandable between Spanish, and Aranese is one of those. And Basque is an entirely separate language. Basque is not related to any other language in Europe, and it is spoken in the north, kind of mid-north of the Iberian Peninsula. So basically, you have all of these different languages and cultures, to some extent, cultures that exist in this part of the world. So just kind of a note on some of these, which may not be familiar at all, and that is Aranese is a standardized form of Pyrenean Gascon variety of the Occitan language. It's spoken in this Valderan, which is in the northwestern Catalonia, close to the Spanish border with France. And it's one of the three official languages besides Catalan and Spanish. So you have even official languages in Spain, other than Portuguese, which are different enough that you would need a translator for many of these languages to speak between them. So Portuguese is and it's called the lingua portuguesa, is a Western Romance language of the Indo-European language family, which means that it's related to French, it's related to Italian, it's related to Romanian, it's related to the other Romance languages. And it has cognates, and it's for doing research. If you know Spanish, it is, I would call it relatively doable to learn what you need to know to translate and work with Portuguese records, and vice versa. If you know Portuguese, it's not much a greater effort to work and understand Spanish records. It's also important to know all the places where these languages where Portuguese has been spoken. And because of the fact that the Portuguese sailors traveled throughout the world and established Portuguese colonies in all around the world. And currently it's the official language of Portugal and Brazil. Primarily Brazil is this huge country in South America, and Cape Verde, Angola, Mozambique in Africa, Guinea-Bissau, which is also in Africa, and Sao Tome and Principe, which are islands. And it's also the language has a co-official status in East Timor, Equatorial Guinea, and Macau. So there's lots of places around the world. And a Portuguese speaker is referred to as somebody who is a lusophone, meaning they speak Portuguese. And that's important when you're doing this kind of research, because you can get a lot of different places. Your ancestors could have come from any one of those places and have spoken Portuguese, and so that may be surprising that they came from Africa and spoke Portuguese, or from different parts of the Indonesian world and Asian world. Portuguese gained its independence from Spain in 1128, when they began that process in 1128, and ended with the defeat of Castile in 1385. So it took pretty much over 100 years or so of warfare before Portugal established itself as a country separate from Spain. And so this is a very important thing, because if you go back into that time period, it's very possible that the records would become primarily Spanish records, because Spain was the ascendant power at that time. So here's a map that kind of shows you the outlines of the different areas of Spain as they existed back in the 1300s. Now, it's important to understand the history of each of the countries where you do your research. The reason that it seems to be obvious once you begin to understand the history, but it's something that a lot of people overlook. They think they can just go in and look for records, and it doesn't matter really much what the history was. The problem is that the location of where the records are kept is governed entirely by the jurisdictional historical history of the country. So because Spain was, say, fragmented into various, what we might call their own countries, individual countries, and only became consolidated in 1492, then almost entirely during the hundreds of years of history was involved with some level of warfare. It's also important to understand that during the period of time before, in the early 1300s, and part of the issues that were going on was that Spain was facing an invasion by the Moors, or would be called Arabs today, by the Arabs from Africa across the Straits of Gibraltar, and that the Arabs actually conquered clear up into France before they were driven back they held on to the southern part of Spain until it was consolidated by Ferdinand Isabella in 1492. So there's some other very important things that happened about that time that I'll talk about in a little while. So beginning in very early times, the Portuguese have been sailors and traders for an extensive period of time. But in 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Now, the Cape of Good Hope is the long point down at the end of Africa. And up to that point in time, that part of the world had not been explored extensively by Europeans. And it was unknown how far the land went. And so he sailed south until he could sail west, and then began the process of sailing north until he ran into some more land. So he had rounded that, and that, of course, opened up a tremendous amount of trade routes between India and China and the European countries, and that was quickly taken advantage of by the Portuguese explorers. And then from 1497 to 1499, Vasco da Gama, on subsequent voyages, discovered India and places east, and so this became a very important part of Portuguese history, that the expansion of what became the Portuguese Empire. Pedro Alvarez Cabral sailed out of Portugal at about that time and tried to reach India, and he was blown off course and ended up crossing the entire Atlantic Ocean and landing in Brazil. And there was subsequent conflict between Portugal and Spain as to which part of South America was owned by the Spanish Empire and which was owned by the Portuguese Empire. And that it was settled finally by the Pope, who divided the two countries and gave Portugal what is now the major part of what is now Brazil. There's some important dates that also affected how the records were kept and where the records came from. So, for example, in 1807, Napoleon invaded Spain and thereby Portugal, and installed his son on the throne of Spain. And so that became part of the Napoleonic Empire. Of course, Napoleon's empire only lasted a relatively short time, but the impact of Napoleon's empire was that Napoleon imposed a duty to report records and record records of people. So up to this point in time, into 1800s, the primary way of recording records was done by the church, by the Catholic Church in Portugal as well as in Spain. But when Napoleon came, he instituted what was called civil registration. And so all the countries of all the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries and many other countries in Europe began the process of keeping records by the government, or civil registration records, apart from the church records, primarily due to the fact that Napoleon had started this particular practice. And so you'll find dates extending from the early to the late 1800s for the start of the date of recording information. So, for example, in the countries of South America, around 1850, you'll find each of the countries beginning some form of civil registration. These are very helpful because the Catholic Church recorded baptisms and not births, and marriages and burials, but not death records. So when you have only the church records, you very, very seldom get a birth date, an actual birth date. You get a baptism date, and you almost never get a death date. You get a burial date. Whereas Napoleon's under the Napoleonic civil registration, they recorded births, marriages, and deaths. So when you get to the mid 1800s, generally speaking, then you'll have a form of records that shows birth, deaths, marriages, baptisms, and burials. You'll get all of those potentially all of those kinds of records from the countries that have adopted this form of recording their records. This is true for all of Central and South America. Every country in Central and South America at some point in time has adopted, including Brazil, has adopted civil registration and has maintained Catholic church records all the time. And Catholic churches remain predominant in all of those countries, and in Spain and in Portugal. In 1910, the Portuguese founded the Republic. What that means is that they quit having a king. Either they kept the king and operated independently of the king, which is usually what happened. And then in May 1926, there was imposed a military dictatorship. And from 61 to 71, there were colonial wars, and many of the colonies broke off and established their independence from Portugal. And then there's what was called in 1974, which was called the Carnation Revolution. And that was the reason it's called the Carnation Revolution was because the revolutionaries went around putting carnations in the barrels of the guns and raised enough support for reform to get rid of the military dictatorship and began a parliamentary kind of form of government. And then in 1985, Portugal joined the EU and is now an EU country or a European Union country. Here's a map of the extent of the Portuguese Empire from 1414 to 1999. You can see the dates that when various colonies were established and the time that they were, or the ports of call that were in use around the world. So this was a rather an extensive amount of influence on a lot of places in the world. Now, an interesting part about this, primarily for genealogists, is that the records for all of those places, all those different places, may be in the National Archives of the Torre do Tombo, which is the National Archives building here in Portugal. That's the good news. And the good news further is that most of those records are available online, or many of them are, not directly from the large family search genealogical websites like Family Search or Ancestry or whatever, but directly from Portugal. To begin, and this is the basic fact, this is how you get started with doing genealogy in any Catholic country. If you want to say Spanish-speaking or Catholic country, you'll have exactly the same process. And the process is very straightforward, although not simple. And the straightforward part of it is you need to know a complete name of the person, an approximate date of at least one person, and an exact place, which preferably is the name of the church where an event occurred. Okay, so let's suppose that your ancestors came from Brazil and they came from Portugal, and you wanted to do research first in Brazil, and then you wanted to do the research in Portugal. Well, to establish a beginning point for your research in Brazil, you would need to know this information, the complete name. And when we say complete name, we mean complete name of the individual, because there are an amazingly number of people with the same names in all Spanish-speaking countries. And the approximate date. Now, dates are not entirely, all of the date will do is cut down or limit the amount of page-by-page research that you're going to end up doing, looking for any individual. Even if you get a record, even if you have an index to a record, you need to make absolutely sure that you have the right person and that you are working in a very, very specific geographic point. You know the exact place that the events, because otherwise you're going to be looking for, you're going to be very easily for you to pick up someone with the very same name that you think is the right person. So now when you're in that position, then you have the ability to start looking for specific individuals. Now, at some point in time, you may run into the fact that your people came from Portugal, in which case you have to go through this process again. In other words, you can only begin your research in Portugal looking for a Portuguese immigrant to either Brazil or some other country, unless you know specifically the name of the person when they left, that they were using or had when they were in Portugal, and an approximate date and an exact place in Portugal. It doesn't help to have a general part. There are hundreds of parishes in Portugal. And just kind of a word about the Spanish language and Portuguese language church records. All Catholic church records are based on the geographic subdivisions of the Catholic Church. The smallest subdivision is the parish that has a parish priest. And a group of parishes is basically put in together, and they are called the diocese. And the diocese often has a bishop in charge of the diocese, but maybe a priest or some other official of the church. But there's a relationship, because it's customary in the Catholic Church for the diocese to make a copy of the parish registers periodically, usually annually. And so you can usually have two different places to look for the records. If you can't find them in a parish, you may be able to find them in the diocese. And if you can't find them in the diocese, you're going to have to look for the parish and find out which parish it was where they lived. Now, a parish can be a very small geographic area, particularly in a major city. And so the accuracy in learning and progressing in doing research in Portugal or in any other Catholic country depends entirely on following this scenario of knowing the names and the dates and the place. And we'll get into why you need to know the names so specifically when we get, or need a complete name, just as I go along here. So this is the main reason. So many names are common that finding one person requires very careful research. You really have to look carefully. The names can be extremely, very, very common. And basically, Portugal's personal names are not only sometimes hard to decipher because of the handwriting, they're very difficult because they are complex. They're very complex names. And in some cases, for example, it's not uncommon that in Portugal that a married woman has 2 names and 6 surnames. So they can have 2 from their mother's family, 2 from her father's family, and the last 2 coming from her husband. Some of these names may be made up of more than one word, so that a full feminine name can have more than 12 words and up to 15 or more words. That's one name. And if you have a string of people that have names that are 15 words long, you have to be very careful that every one of those 15 names is exactly the same. because you're going to have enough, two people could have just one of those names different. And so this is it can be a very interesting exercise to pull out the full name of some of the women in Portuguese. And so what happens here also is a great benefit, of course, because now when you have one of these very complex compound names, you basically have an outline of two generations of a family. And so you have both the mother's and father's surnames. And so you have really going back another generation because those names are made up of their parents. So this is it's a little bit complex, but it's very beneficial to genealogical research. And sometimes I wonder why we all didn't do it that way, and then we wouldn't have so many troubles with people like named with the same name. Another side benefit of this is that if you can identify this very, very specific place, once you find one name of a person, you basically have a key to researching it further in the records and finding additional names, and you're already been given the surnames. And in the baptismal record, it's very possible that both the father and the mother are named completely. And so you have basically a way to get back and find the father's baptismal record and the mother's baptismal record, and then you have both their parents' baptismal records and both their parent or wife's parents' baptismal records and so forth. And it is not unusual to use that information to go back until the records run out, and also come back on descendancy with many, many more. And in a lot of cases, it will be that you find that all of the people in a particular parish are related at some point. And so you can spend an awful lot of time. I have friends over the years that have gotten hundreds into thousands of names by simply going around and around and around in the same parish or very closely related parishes, and finding just everybody was related to them. And then if you take a DNA test, for example, you can then verify that what your initial research, at least back a few generations, is correct. It has been the case in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America that they have not been open to allowing people to have genealogical DNA tests, and that has only started just quite recently in the last couple of years. Previously, a couple of years ago, as I would talk to people in Latin America, they would say, no, they can't get DNA tests here, but now they can. There are some companies that have started providing DNA tests, and then they can use the same DNA information and put that into a larger program like MyHeritage that would allow them to upload the raw data. So it's kind of interesting that this would be a helpful development. Now, one thing that really helps all genealogists in various countries is that the Family Search Research Wiki, which is under the search tab there on the FamilySearch.org website, has genealogical word lists. Now, these were compiled many years ago into a series of books that we call the white books. They were paper-bound, were white 8.5 by 11 books that told the basics of research in various parts of the world, all around the world. And these white books were part of the initial seeding of the research wiki. So all of that information, including the genealogical word lists, were included. And so you're going to have word lists for the green parts over on the right-hand side of all those countries, Portugal and all the other countries down there, that would be very helpful in doing research if you don't happen to speak Portuguese. Oh, one more point, and before I move on, is that there are extra letters in Portuguese. and just like there are in Spanish. And so you need to look carefully at the alphabet. And when you do, then you may find that there are other letters that affect the way that if any of the texts are indexed and have been indexed alphabetically, then you need to make an account, make sure you're accounting for the fact that some letters may be alphabetized in a different way than you would normally think because there are extra letters. Now, the Portuguese Catholic Church records in Portugal itself date from 1562, when the Council of Trent of the Catholic Church mandated that parish priests were required to record births, marriages, and deaths. Now, there were some records that were recorded before that time, but they weren't mandated to be recorded. So that's sort of the official starting date for a general time when those records may have been better available. When you begin to do research, it's important that you get an idea about the Family Search Research Catalog. So the Family Search Catalog. What happens here is that from a standpoint of records being outside of Portugal and available in the larger genealogical websites, Family Search has by and large the most records by far. There's really very few Portuguese records in any of the other websites as currently, by doing a search in each of the websites catalogs to see how many records they have from Portugal or primarily from Brazil. So what you're going to do is use the catalog a lot and become acquainted with the different Portuguese provinces, places within Portugal of all the different places, because that gets you started in narrowing down the area and the number of records that you would have to look at. So you need to search by parish for the church records. So you go into each of the areas in Portugal until you're down to the parish level, and then you'll see what church records are actually available. And as I mentioned, there's three major kinds of records. The first kind of record are baptismal records. And baptismal records in Portugal, as is the case in the rest of the Latin-speaking world, or all of the other countries, the Catholic countries, basically have the same format. And the same format has been used for, in some cases, hundreds of years. And so when you begin the process of understanding the records, the amount of information that you need to know, the language you need to know is mainly the names and place names and personal names of the individuals, which will be different. But the rest of the words in the records are usually consistent. They may change slightly over time, and they may not be as complete sometimes because the priests did not follow exact format. But generally speaking, if you pick up a record in any Spanish or Portuguese country, or Italian, or any of the other languages in Catholic, where there are Catholic records, even in English, you're going to find the records to be very similarly worded. So that makes it doable even if you don't learn a great deal about Spanish, you can learn how to decipher the records. Marriage records, back to baptism records. The one thing that I would mention is that the name of the person being baptized, the baby, generally is in the left-hand column of each page. So that lets you kind of go through and look quickly for names when you're searching these kinds of records. Another thing that's important is that we assume, I think incorrectly, that baptism or christening in the Catholic Church was always done at or near the time of the birth, and that is not correct. it is very possible that the person was not baptized until sometime later in their life. And often what does occur quite often is that you'll find that a person was baptized only shortly before they got married, because they went to get married in the church and the priest said, well, you have been baptized. So they had to go through the catechism and be baptized before they could get married in the church. So that's important to understand, that you don't automatically in any Catholic country put, say your birth date was the same as, or very close to, or even in the same year as the baptism date, unless you want to get in trouble down the road, because putting in that kind of arbitrary calculation saying, oh, they had to be baptized when they were 8 days old or something like that, that's not necessarily correct. There were factors of travel, of costs, and many other factors that basically have people baptized at a very different date than their birth date. Marriage records are also helpful because they have some information in the margins, in the edge, in the left-hand column. That helps you get at least into the records, but you've got to be careful here, because the name that is recorded there may not be the name that you are looking for. In other words, that may be their first name, and there was a tendency in Catholic countries to add the name Maria or Jose to almost every name when the person were baptized. So that can sometimes show up depending on that particular time and the particular place that the records are being searched. So you may end up not having the exact name, the total name of the person, until you do and go through and read the text. And burial records are just that. They're a record of the burials, and the burials have usually taken place around the periphery of the cathedral or someplace very close to the cathedral, and that's the burial ground. And so, of course, you can assume that the person died, and that the death was probably not too many days different than the burial. The burial and the death are usually very close dates. But as I mentioned previously, the church records will record the burials, but the civil registration, when they're available, will record the death and not necessarily the burial. Okay, so in 1832, the government passed legislation requiring that births, marriages, and deaths of all residents be recorded at the local civil registry. And as I mentioned previously, that was only done by the churches before that mandate. This is the actual date of the beginning of civil registration, registros civis, that were done in, which were started in Portugal. This seems like it's just an arbitrary date. It was the date that they began the process, and that didn't mean everybody started with the process on that date, and that there's always an area called the time of compliance with the rule. And so you need to be aware of that civil registration records may only exist in certain areas, in certain provinces, beginning on different dates, and sometimes that information is available, and usually is available from the Family Search Research Wiki by looking for Portuguese and then looking up Portugal and then looking up the individual provinces. This is not the good news. The bad news here is that Family Search only has a very few Portuguese civil registration records. Now we're talking about Portugal, not Brazil. So this would be Portuguese records. But Ancestry.com and MyHeritage don't have any. They don't show having any civil registration records as of the date of this. They may acquire some in the future, but right now, Family Search is the only one that has any. And that's checking both on the catalog and in the images records on Family Search. So that may change. So they may start to get civil registration records, but presently they do not. Now, the good news is that the records are available online and are searchable, and they are at the National Archive of the Tower of Tombo, or Torre do Tombo, and they can be searched directly from this website. So you can see that they've got a list of most views and then other recent records that they've been adding to it. So Portugal does have a rather extensive collection of digital records that you can go to get information and do some research. And they go back, the documents at the Tombo National Archive go back as far as 1161 AD. And just as a note, it has 87 miles of document shelves. So if you wanted a long exercise, or you wanted to do a sort of a long run, you could run the shelves or walk the shelves of the National Archives. So there's just a lot of records here. And as I indicated previously, these are records from around the whole world of Portuguese contacts around the world. So there may be some very unusual records here. So many of the parish records and civil registration records are on the Tombo website. It's tombo.pt. And you can see here's a list of records that were just recently added in 2023, parish books, and numbers and numbers of books of records that are being added. So this is quite an extensive website, and will help get you going in Portuguese research. There are some other places where Portuguese records are available. They're somewhat limited access, but this one is at Dartmouth College, and it's called the Claire T. Carney Library, and it has Portuguese American genealogy. And from this list, it tells you a lot more information about which records they have and their specific records, and the places where those additional places where those records may be available. You'll see that Torre de Tombo is mentioned, and there are other archives, more local archives, that also in their kind of regional archives, and so there is additional records that can be in places where the records could be found. Whenever you're going to be using this kind of an archive, you need to be very careful that you followed whatever rules or restrictions there may be on the archives, because your access is going to be dependent on your ability to follow the rules very closely and not get your access revoked. There are some more resources. There's the International Society of Genetic Genealogy Wiki, that's ISOG. And ISOG has a Portuguese genealogy resources for Portuguese DNA projects, as is the case now going around the world. As I mentioned, even though they're only recently now becoming available, Portuguese DNA, there are some records, there are some ways to match in Portuguese genealogy. This is kind of one key to being able to find the exact place of origin of particular ancestors. Even though you may not know enough to find or look for any records at all that are online, if you get a DNA test and find relatives that are matched to you, and they are at specific places in Portugal, then you have a place to start looking for records. And they may also be on some of the larger DNA websites, particularly, as I mentioned before, MyHeritage And from that standpoint, you can communicate directly to those people and find out what kinds of records that they may have. So it's opening up. Genealogy is opening up dramatically because of the amount of information that is being gathered to the repositories, but also because of DNA connections that allow you to specify a particular area. To get some beginning information and some direction that is very valuable, you can go to the Family History Guide and go to the country section and look for Portugal records, and then you'll see some more specific instructions about doing some research in Portuguese genealogy. The BYU Family History Library has specific instructions for doing Portuguese genealogical research. And this is a document that was put together quite some time ago. These area studies kinds of instructions are old, but they are very useful because they can give you information about kinds of questions you need to answer in order to find a specific ancestor. For example, someone who immigrated to the United States or to some other country. There is also on the BYU website an introduction to Portuguese script tutorial. So you can take lessons. That's free. It's open. The script tutorial is in various languages and various scripts, and it'll help you immensely to go through these instructions to read some of the old Portuguese records. One thing that happens across Europe and basically around the world is that writing patterns, the way people wrote, were fairly stable and also fairly international. So when you're looking at a type of writing that was done in Portugal in the early 1800s or in 1700s, it's going to be very, very similar to writing systems that were used in other countries. Now, one thing that's very interesting about this is that in both Spain and Portugal, right around the time that the Moors were driven out of the country in 1492, that's the magic date. We think of that as being when Columbus discovered America, but it was even more significant for the Jewish population of Spain and Portugal was that was when they were driven out of the country during that period of time. You may find that your ancestors came from Portugal, but that they left Portugal at an early period of time, and therefore they were Jewish. And so it's interesting. Another byproduct of a DNA test is that it may tell you that you have Middle Eastern or even a specific Jewish group of connections, and this may be what happened, and that is that the Jews were sent around the world and left to both Spain and Portugal under pain of being killed or joining the Catholic Church. Now, another thing happened that was a little bit harder to understand. The Jews numbered in the tens of thousands, but they were expelled in 1536, and there's only about 1,000 Jews left in Portugal today. So there's not very many Jewish people in Portugal, but there's lots of people around the world who are descendants of Portuguese Jews. This is another possibility. The other possibility is that instead of leaving the country, the Jews ostensibly joined the Catholic Church. They were baptized into the Catholic Church, and for all intents and purposes, they became Catholics. But they maintained their own secret culture of being Jews. So they continued to observe all of the restrictions of Judaism. And so they were kind of on the Sabbath day, which we would be called Saturday, they were Jews. On Sunday, they were Catholics. And they were, as a group, they're known as crypto-Jews or crypto-Judaism. And so they were secretly Jews, but they were publicly professing another faith. so people didn't know they were Jews. And this is a fascinating history. And I have in just the last little while, the last couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, back at Rootstech, I talked to someone who had questions for me because they had discovered that their ancestors were Jews. These were crypto Jews, that they had always assumed that they were Catholics or what other Church of England or whatever, and they weren't. They were practicing Judaism. They were also known as conversos, marranos, or anusim. So this happened beginning in the 1300s, and then when the Jews were driven out of Spain and Portugal. One interesting side note to that is that not too recent, but historical research into Columbus's the crews on Columbus's boats, it turns out that many of these people were Jewish, and they had used that way of getting out of the country. So that was an interesting side note. One of the most active crypto-Jewish organizations is part of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society that's been around since 1985. And so this website on crypto Jews will give you the information that you have about the king of Portugal who exposed the Jews in 1497. But they converted in name only. And this is an organization that has extensive documentation and contacts for finding out information about a possible crypto-Jewish ancestry. Okay. Thanks for watching.